December the 26th, 1944. The frozen forests of Belgium echoed with the thunder of German panzers as Oberleutnant Heinrich Müller surveyed the smoking wreckage of what should have been an invincible Panther tank. His hands trembled not from the bitter cold, but from the impossible sight before him. A clean penetration through 80 millimeters of sloped frontal armor, a wound that should only come from an 88 millimeter G.Un or larger. Yet the American Sherman responsible sat merely 200 meters away, its stubby 76 millimeter gun still trained on his position. "Unmöglich," he whispered, his breath forming clouds in the winter air. The crew of Panther No. 423 had been among his best men, veterans who had survived the Eastern Front's hell only to die here in the Ardennes, to what Germans dismissively called Tommy Cookers. The Battle of the Bulge had begun 10 days earlier with such promise. Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West had caught the Americans completely off guard, and Müller's 5th Panzer Army had driven deep into Allied lines. The Panther tanks, with their powerful 75 millimeter high-velocity guns and superior armor, had initially dominated the battlefield. American Shermans fell like wheat before a scythe, their standard 75 millimeter guns bouncing harmlessly off German armor at any reasonable combat distance. Even the newer 76 millimeter Shermans, while an improvement, had proven inadequate against the Panther's frontal armor when firing conventional armor-piercing rounds. The German tankers had grown confident, perhaps too confident, in their technological superiority. But something had changed in the past 48 hours. Reports had filtered up through the command structure, reports that Müller had initially dismissed as panic or exaggeration. American Shermans were killing Panthers from the front at ranges exceeding 500 meters. Impossible, the training manual said. The mathematics didn't support it. A 76 millimeter gun-firing standard M62 armor-piercing shot could not penetrate a Panther's glacis plate at such distances. Yet here lay the evidence, smoking and undeniable. The crew inside burned beyond recognition. Müller climbed onto the destroyed Panther's hull, his boots slipping on the ice-covered steel. The entry hole told a story that contradicted everything he knew about ballistics. The penetration was too clean, too deep. Standard armor-piercing rounds created a different signature when they punched through steel. This looked almost like the work of a tungsten core penetrator, but the Americans supposedly had severe shortages of tungsten. Intelligence reports had been clear on that point. The United States had diverted most of its tungsten supplies to strategic bomber production and other priority programs, leaving their tank ammunition manufacturers scrambling for alternatives. "Herr Oberleutnant," Feldwebel Kurt Weber called out, his voice cutting through Müller's thoughts. The grizzled sergeant had fought in Poland, France, and Russia, surviving battles that had killed better men. If Weber sounded concerned, there was reason for concern. 3rd Panzer Company reports 2 more Panthers destroyed, same sector, both frontal penetrations. The Americans are using something new. Müller jumped down from the wrecked tank, his mind racing through possibilities. If the Americans had developed a new type of ammunition capable of defeating Panther armor, the implications were catastrophic. Germany's armored advantage, already eroding under the weight of Allied numbers, could evaporate entirely. The Panther tank had been designed specifically to counter the Soviet T-34, with armor and firepower superior to anything the Western Allies fielded. Losing that edge would doom any German counteroffensive, including Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Bulge offensive itself. "Assemble the available Panther commanders," Müller ordered, his voice carrying the weight of command despite his growing unease. "We need to understand what we're facing, and get division intelligence on the radio. I want to know if other units are experiencing the same phenomenon." As Weber hurried away to carry out the orders, Müller took one last look at the destroyed Panther. Somewhere in the American supply chain, someone had developed a solution to the Panther problem. The question wasn't whether the new ammunition existed. The evidence lay before him in twisted steel and burned flesh. The question was how effective it truly was, and whether German tactics could adapt quickly enough to counter this unexpected threat. The answer would determine not just the outcome of individual tank duels, but potentially the fate of the entire Western Front. 6 months earlier, on July the 4th, 1944, while Americans celebrated Independence Day, a very different kind of fireworks display was occurring at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Captain Robert Morrison of the United States Army Ordnance Department walks. Head through binoculars as a 76mm Sherman fired at a captured Panther tank, positioned 600 yards downrange. The first round, a standard M62 armor-piercing shot, struck the Panther's frontal slope and ricocheted skyward with a shower of sparks, exactly as predicted. Morrison nodded to the firing crew, and they loaded the second round, one that looked deceptively similar to the first, but carried within it the potential to revolutionize American armored warfare. The report from the gun came sharper, louder somehow, and through his binoculars Morrison saw the impossible become real. The Panther's glacis plate, that impenetrable shield that had frustrated American tankers since Normandy, now bore a clean penetration hole. "Jesus Christ," breathed Major Thomas Wellborn, Morrison's superior officer. It actually worked. The two men rushed forward to examine the target, their boots kicking up dust from the sun-baked Maryland soil. The HVAP round, hypervelocity armor piercing, had performed exactly as the engineers had promised, and perhaps even better. According to documents from the Ordnance Department archives, later compiled in military historian Stephen Zaloga's authoritative works on Sherman tank development, the HVAP project had begun as a desperate response to intelligence reports from Europe. American tank crews were dying in disproportionate numbers when facing German Panthers and Tigers, their standard ammunition proving inadequate against the superior German armor. The 76mm gun, rushed into production to give Shermans better anti-tank capability, was still insufficient. Something radical was needed, and it needed to come quickly. The solution lay in a principle that American engineers had understood theoretically, but struggled to implement practically: the relationship between projectile mass, velocity, and penetration. The HVAP round used a tungsten carbide core surrounded by a lightweight aluminum or mild steel body. When fired, the lighter overall weight of the projectile allowed it to achieve velocities of nearly 3,400 feet per second, compared to 2,600 feet per second for standard ammunition. Upon impact, the soft outer body stripped away, and the dense tungsten core, traveling at tremendous velocity, punched through armor like a nail through wood. But there was a problem, and it was a serious one. Tungsten was rare, desperately needed for cutting tools, aircraft components, and 1,000 other war applications. The War Production Board had already restricted tungsten use, allocating the limited supply to the most critical needs. Manufacturing HVAP rounds in the quantities needed to supply every Sherman tank in Europe was simply impossible. The engineers at Aberdeen had created a war-winning weapon that America couldn't afford to mass-produce. "We can make them work," Morrison told Wellborn as they examined the test results, "but we can't make enough of them." The solution came from an unexpected quarter. Colonel James Cruz, a logistics officer who had served in the First World War, proposed a radical rationing system. Instead of trying to supply every Sherman with HVAP ammunition, the Ordnance Department would manufacture limited quantities and distribute them only to frontline tank destroyer and Sherman battalions, with strict limitations on use. Tank commanders would receive perhaps 5 to 10 HVAP rounds per tank, to be used only against heavy German armor, Panthers, Tigers, and the dreaded King Tigers. Every other target would be engaged with standard ammunition. It was a compromise born of necessity, but it might just work. Production began in August of 1944, with shells leaving American factories marked with distinctive black tips to distinguish them from standard ammunition. The first shipments arrived in France in September, distributed to select armored units with strict instructions on their use. Tank crews received special training, learning to identify targets worthy of the precious HVAP rounds. A Panzer IV tank? Use standard ammunition. A Panther or Tiger? Break out the HVAP. The rationing was so strict that some tank commanders reported receiving only 3 HVAP rounds per tank, expected to last for the entire Ardennes campaign. The Germans, meanwhile, had no idea what was coming. Their intelligence services had correctly identified American tungsten shortages and had concluded that any American tungsten core ammunition would be produced in such limited quantities as to be tactically irrelevant. It was a reasonable assumption based on solid intelligence, but it failed to account for American ingenuity in logistics and distribution, The United States couldn't produce HVAP rounds in abundance, but they could produce enough to matter, and more importantly, they could get those rounds to the tankers who needed them most when they needed them most. Captain Morrison watched the final test firings at Aberdeen with satisfaction, mixed with apprehension. The HVAP rounds worked brilliantly in testing, but combat was another matter entirely. Would tank crews remember their training under fire? Would they husband their precious HVAP rounds for truly dangerous targets, or would they waste them on lesser threats? Would the ammunition perform as well in the frozen forests of Europe as it did on Maryland test ranges? These questions would be answered soon enough, and the answers would be written in blood and burned steel across the battlefields of France, Belgium, and Germany. November the 8th, 1944 brought Staff Sergeant Jack Hammer Henriksen his first look at a Panther tank through anything other than a training manual's grainy photographs. His Sherman, nicknamed Bad News and armed with the newer 76mm gun, sat hull down behind a shattered farmhouse near Metz, France, while the massive German tank prowled the crossroads 400 yards distant. Henriksen's hands were steady on the controls despite his pounding heart. 3 years of training and 6 months of combat had taught him that fear and steadiness could coexist. His gunner, Corporal Mike Delacroix, had the Panther centered in his sights, but neither man moved to fire. With standard ammunition, a frontal shot at this range would only announce their position and invite a lethal response from the Panther's powerful 75mm gun. "Hammer, we got those special rounds, right?" Delacroix's voice crackled through the intercom, thick with his Louisiana accent. "The black tips?" Henriksen nodded, though his gunner couldn't see him in the tight confines of the tank. They had received 5 HVAP rounds 3 days earlier, along with stern instructions from Lieutenant Morrison, no relation to the Aberdeen captain, to use them only against Panthers, Tigers, or other heavy armor. Every round was accounted for, serial numbers logged, usage to be reported and justified after action. The Army clearly considered these special shells more valuable than gold, which made Henriksen nervous about using them. What if he missed? What if he wasted a precious HVAP round on a shot that didn't need it? The Panthers' commander apparently spotted something because the turret began traversing toward their position. Decision time. "Load HVAP," Henriksen ordered, his voice calm despite knowing they had perhaps 15 seconds before that high-velocity German gun found them. The loader, Private Danny Sullivan, fresh from Kansas and newer to the crew than Henriksen liked, fumbled with the black-tipped round. "Careful with that, Sullivan. That shell costs more than you make in a year." Gallows humor, the universal language of men facing death. But it worked. Sullivan's hands steadied, and the breech clanged shut. "Up! Fire!" The gun roared, the Sherman rocking back on its suspension, and Henriksen's world narrowed to a single point of burning focus. Through the vision slit, he saw the tracer arc across the gray November afternoon, the trajectory flatter and faster than any round he'd fired before. The impact came with a different sound than he'd expected, not the sharp ping of a ricochet, but a deeper, duller thunk of metal yielding to metal. "Hit!" Delacroix shouted. "Penetration! Holy shit, we punched right through him!" The Panther sat motionless for perhaps 3 seconds, smoke beginning to pour from the commander's hatch. And then the crew began bailing out. Henriksen counted 4 men scrambling away from their dying tank before the ammunition cooked off, sending the turret 10 feet into the air in a spectacular explosion that Sullivan would describe in letters home for years afterward. "Did that really just happen?" the loader asked, his voice somewhere between awe and disbelief. "Did we just kill a Panther from the front?" They had indeed, and the implications rippled through 3rd Armored Division faster than radio reports could carry them. By nightfall, every Sherman commander with HVAP rounds was reassessing their tactical options. The Panther was no longer the invincible predator that forced American tanks into desperate flanking maneuvers or suicidal bum rushes hoping to get a side shot. With HVAP ammunition, a Sherman could engage Panthers from the front at ranges that had previously been suicide. It didn't make the Sherman equal to the Panther. The German tank still had superior armor, superior optics, and a more powerful gun overall. But it leveled the playing field enough that American numerical superiority and better crew training could make the difference. Word spread through the armored units with the speed of wildfire, carrying with it a dangerous mixture of confidence and overconfidence. Some tank commanders began hoarding their HVAP rounds, refusing to use them even in situations that clearly warranted it, terrified of wasting the precious ammunition. Others went the opposite direction, expending their entire HVAP allocation in a single engagement, forgetting that they might face Panthers again tomorrow with nothing but standard ammunition. The learning curve was steep and written in casualties, both American and German. Lieutenant Colonel James Leach, commanding 2nd Battalion, 33rd Armored Regiment, recognized the problem and issued new guidelines based on those first weeks of HVAP combat use. Tank commanders were to use HVAP rounds when facing Panthers or Tigers at ranges exceeding 300 yards, or when frontal shots were the only option. At closer ranges or with flank shots available, standard ammunition remained adequate and would preserve the HVAP rounds for situations where only they would suffice. It was a delicate calculus, requiring split-second decisions under fire, and not every commander got it right. Henriksen's crew got it right more often than not, which was why bad news survived November and December while so many other Shermans burned. They developed a rhythm, a doctrine born of experience rather than training manuals. Delacroix learned to identify Panthers instantly by their distinctive profile and sound. The Panther's Maybach engine had a particular growl that experienced tankers could distinguish from other German armor. When they heard that sound and couldn't get a flank shot, the HVAP rounds came out. When they faced Panzer IVs or lighter German armor, they saved the expensive ammunition for worthier targets. By the time Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge, exploded across the Ardennes in December, American tank crews had refined their HVAP tactics through hard experience. They understood the ammunition's capabilities and limitations, knew when to use it and when to save it, and most importantly, believed in it. That belief, that confidence that they could hurt Panthers from the front, changed the psychological dynamic of American armored warfare. German tankers would soon learn what Oberleutnant Müller was discovering in those frozen Belgian forests. The Americans had found a way to kill Panthers, and nothing would ever be quite the same. January the 3rd, 1945, found Major Ernst Bauer of the German Army Intelligence Service sitting in a cramped office in a requisitioned Belgian farmhouse, surrounded by reports that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Before him lay testimony from 17 different Panther crews who had survived encounters with American Shermans, along with metallurgical analysis of recovered projectile fragments and photographs of penetrated armor plate. The evidence was undeniable. The Americans possessed a new type of ammunition with dramatically improved penetration characteristics, yet German intelligence had failed to predict it, prepare for it, or even recognize it initially when reports first surfaced. The failure began, Bauer realized as he reviewed earlier intelligence assessments, with an over-reliance on technical assumptions about American industrial capabilities. German intelligence knew the Americans faced severe tungsten shortages. Their own spies in the Economic Warfare Division had documented extensive American efforts to secure tungsten supplies from China, Bolivia, and other sources. The logical conclusion, supported by what seemed like solid reasoning, was that America couldn't produce tungsten-core anti-tank ammunition in militarily significant quantities. That conclusion had been correct in its particulars, but disastrously wrong in its implications. Yes, the Americans couldn't produce HVAP rounds in abundance, but they didn't need to. They only needed enough to matter, and they had achieved that threshold. "We made the classic mistake," Bauer told Hauptmann Werner Schmidt, his assistant, as they reviewed the accumulated evidence. "We assumed our enemies would face the same constraints we face and make the same decisions we would make." Germany, with its shrinking resource base and increasingly desperate strategic situation, would have hoarded any tungsten for truly critical applications, jet engine components perhaps, or high-priority weapon systems. The idea of wasting tungsten on tank ammunition that would be used and lost in single engagements seemed illogical from a German perspective. But the Americans operated from a position of material abundance that Germany hadn't enjoyed since the war's early years. They could afford to be wasteful by German standards, and that American profligacy had caught German tactical doctrine completely off guard. The intelligence failure went deeper than mere resource calculations, however. According to captured documents that Bauer had reviewed, the first HVAP rounds had arrived in France in September of 1944. German intelligence should have identified them immediately, analyzed them, and disseminated warnings to panzer units. Instead, early reports of improved American anti-tank performance had been dismissed as exaggeration, confusion in combat, or lucky shots. Panther crews reported impossible penetrations and were told they must have been hit by tank destroyers or suffered flank shots they hadn't observed. The reports accumulated, each one dismissed individually, and the pattern went unrecognized until American HVAP rounds had already claimed scores of Panthers. Part of the problem lay in Germany's deteriorating intelligence infrastructure. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, had been absorbed into the Reich Security Main Office following the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler, and the reorganization had created gaps and inefficiencies at the worst possible time. Field intelligence gathering suffered as experienced officers were reassigned or purged for political reliability. The men who remained were often more concerned with avoiding blame than with providing accurate assessments, leading to a culture where bad news was suppressed or sugar-coated until it could no longer be ignored. "Look at this," Bauer said, holding up a report dated November the 15th. 3rd Panzer Division reports 6 Panthers lost in one day to frontal penetrations by American 76mm guns. The division commander requested immediate investigation. Do you know what happened to his report? Schmidt shook his head. It was filed under combat loss analysis, routine, and never reached anyone with the authority to act on it. By the time someone recognized the pattern, the Americans had been using HVAP rounds for 2 months. The metallurgical analysis told its own story. The tungsten carbide cores recovered from penetrated Panthers were clearly sophisticated, well-manufactured products of a mature industrial program, not experimental ammunition or limited production runs. American ordnance engineers had solved the technical challenges of HVAP production months, perhaps years earlier. The German metallurgists estimated, based on the consistency of the cores they examined, that American HVAP production was probably in the tens of thousands of rounds. Not enough to supply every Sherman in Europe, but far more than German intelligence had believed possible. The tactical implications were devastating, and Bauer's report to higher headquarters pulled no punches. The Panther tank's primary advantage was its frontal immunity to American tank guns at combat ranges, he wrote in measured clinical prose that couldn't quite hide his alarm. That advantage has been partially negated by American HVAP ammunition. While the Panther remains superior in direct comparison, American numerical superiority, typically 3 to 5 Shermans for every Panther, combined with improved anti-tank capabilities fundamentally alters the tactical balance. General der Panzertruppe, Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, read Bauer's report with growing frustration. The Battle of the Bulge, which had begun with such promise in December, was already faltering by early January. American resistance had stiffened, fuel shortages constrained German mobility, and now this, confirmation that one of Germany's key advantages had been compromised. "Why are we learning this now?" Manteuffel demanded during a staff meeting on January the 5th. Why wasn't this identified in September when the Americans first deployed this ammunition? Nobody had a good answer, which was itself an answer. The intelligence failure reflected Germany's broader strategic deterioration, an increasingly dysfunctional command structure, resource constraints that hampered effective intelligence gathering, and a political climate where bearers of bad news risked their careers or lives. The technical capabilities existed to analyze the threat and develop countermeasures, but the institutional capability to do so effectively had eroded to the point of uselessness. Bauer's recommendations were sensible, but largely impossible to implement given Germany's strategic situation in January 1945. He suggested increasing Panther frontal armor thickness, redesigning glacis plates to enhance deflection characteristics, training Panzer commanders to avoid frontal engagements with American armor, and developing new tactical doctrines that assumed American tanks could penetrate Panther frontal armor. All of these recommendations required time, resources, and industrial capacity that Germany no longer possessed. The horse, as Schmidt observed bitterly, had not merely left the barn, but had run clear across several counties while they debated whether to close the barn door. The intelligence failure regarding HVAP ammunition would become a case study in post-war military analysis of how information gathering, institutional culture, and strategic assumptions could combine to produce catastrophic blind spots. But in January 1945, those lessons lay in the future. For the men like Bauer, struggling to provide accurate intelligence to commanders who increasingly didn't want to hear it, and for Panther crews who would face American Shermans knowing their armor advantage had diminished, the only lessons that mattered were immediate, painful, and written in the continuing casualty lists from the Western Front. February the 12th, 1945, brought Oberleutnant Heinrich Müller face to face with the bitter realities of adapted warfare as his Panther crouched in a defilade position near the German town of Prüm, now threatened by advancing American forces. 2 months had passed since that shocking December encounter with Sherman-destroyed Panthers in the Ardennes, 2 months during which German tactical doctrine had undergone rapid, painful evolution. The playbook that had served Panzer forces well since Normandy, rely on frontal armor immunity, engage at range, force American tanks into desperate flanking attempts, no longer worked reliably. Müller and his fellow Panther commanders had learned to fight differently, and the learning process had cost lives. The new doctrine, hastily distributed through division orders and refined through battlefield experience, emphasized mobility and positioning over the static defensive tactics that Panther crews had previously employed. Never give them a stationary frontal target, read the tactical bulletin that Müller had memorized. Maintain oblique angles, exploit terrain, limit exposure time. In practice, this meant constant movement, using hills and buildings to break American sight lines, presenting the Panthers' thick side armor at angles that would encourage ricochets rather than penetrations. It was exhausting, fuel-intensive warfare that played to American strengths in logistics and numbers rather than German strengths in armor and firepower. Feldwebel Kurt Weber, commanding the Panther positioned 50 meters to Müller's right, had survived since Poland by adapting faster than his enemies. The Americans learned to kill us, Weber had observed during a rare quiet moment the previous week. So we need to relearn how to survive. His Panther bore scars from 3 separate HVAP hits, none of which had penetrated because Weber had been moving, presenting angled armor, or exploiting terrain when the American rounds arrived. Survival, Weber insisted, came from never being where the Americans expected, never presenting the clean frontal shot that HVAP rounds were designed to defeat. The tactical evolution wasn't limited to individual tank commanders. Battalion and regiment-level tactics had adapted as well, emphasizing ambush tactics over direct confrontation. German Panther units would allow American Sherman columns to advance into prepared killing zones, where multiple Panthers could engage from different angles simultaneously. The goal was to overwhelm American crews with threats from multiple directions, forcing them to choose which Panther to engage while the others delivered killing shots to Sherman's side or rear armor. It worked when German forces had sufficient numbers and could choose the engagement ground, but both conditions were increasingly rare in February 1945. American tankers, meanwhile, had developed their own tactical responses to German adaptations. Tank platoons learned to advance in formation, with multiple Shermans ready to engage any Panther that exposed itself. If one Sherman drew fire and was destroyed, the others would note the Panther's position and concentrate HVAP fire on it. The mathematics favored the Americans. They could afford to trade one Sherman for one Panther, while Germany couldn't replace either the tank or the trained crew. It was brutal arithmetic but effective, and it ground down German armored strength through steady attrition. Staff Sergeant Henriksen, now commanding a platoon of 4 Shermans after his battlefield promotion in January, had refined his HVAP tactics through hard experience. Bad news had survived the bulge, the push into Germany, and a dozen engagements that should have been fatal, partly through luck but mostly through intelligent use of those precious black-tipped rounds. Henriksen taught his platoon the doctrine he'd developed. Save HVAP for shots that matter, meaning confirmed Panthers or Tigers at range or in frontal aspect. Use terrain and movement to get closer or get flanking shots when possible, but don't hesitate to use HVAP when the tactical situation demands it. The trick, Henriksen told his crews during a February the 10th briefing, is recognizing the difference between a situation where HVAP helps and a situation where nothing helps. If a Panther had them dead to rights at close range, Wasting an HVAP round on a desperate shot just threw away expensive ammunition before dying. Better to use standard ammunition, try to obscure the Panthers' vision with smoke, and maneuver for a better position. But if they had a clear shot at a Panther that hadn't spotted them yet, that was HVAP time. End the threat before it could respond. The evolution of combined arms tactics also played a crucial role. American armored units increasingly coordinated with tank destroyers mounting 90mm guns, artillery forward observers, and fighter-bomber support. When Shermans identified a Panther position, they could call in supporting fires rather than engaging directly with their outgunned 76mm weapons. The HVAP rounds gave Sherman crews a fighting chance in direct engagements, but the smart play was often to avoid direct engagement entirely when alternatives existed. Artillery couldn't be dodged, and a Thunderbolt's rockets didn't care about frontal armor thickness. German responses to American combined arms coordination showed increasing desperation. Panther units tried to operate during bad weather, when American fighter bombers were grounded, but that meant fighting in conditions where visibility was poor and their superior optics provided less advantage. They tried to engage at extremely close ranges, where the confusion of combat made artillery support difficult to coordinate, but close combat negated the Panthers' armor advantage and favored American numbers. Every tactical adaptation opened new vulnerabilities, and American forces were quick to exploit them. By mid-February, the tactical situation had reached a kind of grim equilibrium. Panthers remained dangerous, capable of killing multiple Shermans if properly employed, but they were no longer the battlefield dominators they had been 6 months earlier. HVAP ammunition hadn't made Shermans equal to Panthers. The German tanks still enjoyed advantages in armor, firepower, and optics, but it had narrowed the gap enough that American numerical superiority, better logistics, and air superiority could tilt engagements in American favor. The mathematics of attrition worked against Germany, and no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome the fundamental resource imbalance. Müller watched through his commander's cupola as American Shermans probed toward Prüm, moving in the careful, coordinated fashion that indicated experienced crews who'd learned hard lessons about Panther capabilities. He counted 6 Shermans in the lead element, probably with more following, facing his 4 Panthers. The mathematics weren't favorable, and his fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank, barely enough for an hour of combat maneuvering. This was modern German armored warfare, outgunned, outnumbered, short on fuel, and facing enemies who had learned to kill Panthers from the front. The Americans would take Prüm, probably today, and Müller's mission was simply to make them pay a high enough price that they'd advance cautiously tomorrow. It was the arithmetic of defeat, calculated one engagement at a time, all the way back to the Rhine and beyond. March the 18th, 1945, marked a quiet Sunday at the Pentagon, where Colonel James Cruz reviewed after-action reports from European theater with satisfaction that bordered on vindication. The HVAP program, his program really, had exceeded even optimistic projections. American tank units had expended approximately 23,000 HVAP rounds since deployment began in September 1944, claiming verified destruction of over 400 German Panther tanks, plus additional Tigers and other heavy armor. The kill-to-expenditure ratio, roughly 5.5 rounds expended per confirmed Panther destroyed, suggested that tank crews were using the ammunition judiciously and effectively, exactly as the training and rationing protocols had intended. The broader strategic impact went beyond the raw numbers of destroyed German tanks. HVAP ammunition had fundamentally altered American armored doctrine and, more importantly, the psychology of American tank crews. Prior to HVAP deployment, American tankers had approached Panther engagements with understandable trepidation bordering on fear. The Panther's frontal immunity to American tank guns had created a psychological weight that affected tactical decision-making, sometimes causing American units to avoid engagement or attempt risky flanking maneuvers that resulted in unnecessary casualties. With HVAP rounds in their racks, Sherman crews approached Panthers with healthy respect rather than dread. That psychological shift translated into more aggressive, confident tactical behavior that complemented American advantages in numbers and logistics. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commanding 1st United States Army, had noted the change in a February report to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. The availability of HVAP ammunition for 76mm guns has produced a measurable improvement in tank crew morale and tactical effectiveness. Units equipped with HVAP-capable weapons show increased willingness to accept engagement with German heavy armor and demonstrate more aggressive pursuit of tactical objectives. The report went on to detail specific engagements where Sherman units, confident in their HVAP ammunition, had pressed attacks that might previously have stalled in the face of Panther opposition. The ripple effects extended beyond the armored forces themselves. American infantry units, knowing that supporting tanks could effectively engage Panthers, showed greater willingness to advance in contested terrain. Artillery and air support could be coordinated more effectively. When friendly armor wasn't forced into constant defensive positioning against German heavy tanks, the entire combined arms system functioned more smoothly because one critical vulnerability, Sherman's inability to frontally penetrate Panthers, had been partially addressed. Military historians would later identify HVAP deployment as one of several technical and tactical improvements that, collectively, accelerated the collapse of German resistance in the West during early 1945. The economic calculation proved equally favorable from the American perspective. Each HVAP round cost approximately $78 to manufacture in 1944 dollars, expensive compared to $14 for standard armor-piercing rounds, but cheap compared to the cost of a Sherman tank at roughly $55,000, or the irreplaceable cost of a trained crew. If HVAP rounds prevented Sherman losses, or enabled Sherman crews to destroy Panthers they otherwise couldn't have engaged, the investment paid for itself many times over. Colonel Cruz's memorandum to the Ordnance Department emphasized this point. HVAP expenditure should be evaluated not as ammunition cost, but as insurance premium against tank and crew loss. German responses to HVAP deployment revealed the depth of its impact through their very desperation. Captured documents from March 1945 showed that German armored forces had been ordered to avoid frontal engagements with American tanks whenever possible, a striking reversal of previous doctrine that had emphasized the Panthers' frontal invulnerability. Other documents showed proposals for emergency armor upgrades to Panther production, though Germany's collapsing industrial base made implementation impossible. The Germans were adapting tactically because they couldn't respond materially, always a sign that a weapon system had achieved strategic significance beyond its raw technical capabilities. The historiography of HVAP ammunition has generated interesting debates among military scholars. Some historians, particularly those writing in the immediate post-war period, emphasize the technical characteristics of the ammunition itself: velocity, penetration, and tungsten core design. Later historians, with access to more comprehensive operational records, have argued that HVAP's psychological and doctrinal impacts were more significant than its purely technical capabilities. The ammunition was very good, these scholars argue, but its greatest contribution was enabling American tank crews to fight differently, more confidently, and more aggressively than they had when facing Panthers with only standard ammunition. Dr. Richard Honeycutt, in his authoritative work, Sherman, A History of the American Medium Tank, which synthesizes decades of research from military archives and veteran interviews, noted that HVAP ammunition closed the performance gap between American and German tank armament sufficiently to allow American advantages in numbers, logistics, and crew training to dominate tactical outcomes. The key word in that assessment is sufficiently. HVAP didn't make Shermans equal to Panthers in all respects, but it made them competitive enough that other American advantages could tip the balance. In warfare, sufficiency often matters more than superiority, especially when sufficiency can be produced in quantity, while superiority cannot. The supply chain challenges of HVAP production and distribution deserve mention as well, for they represented a distinctly American approach to the problem of scarce resources. Rather than abandoning tungsten core ammunition as impractical due to resource constraints, American planners had created a distribution system that maximized the impact of limited production. Rounds went to frontline combat units facing the heaviest German armor, not to rear area or training units. Serial number tracking ensured accountability and prevented waste. The system wasn't perfect, Some units received more HVAP rounds than they needed while others went short, but it worked well enough to achieve strategic objectives. By March 1945, with American forces crossing the Rhine and German resistance collapsing, the strategic value of HVAP ammunition was becoming somewhat academic. The German panzer forces, once the Wehrmacht's cutting edge, had been ground down to shadows of their former strength. Fuel shortages immobilized tanks that battle damage hadn't destroyed, and replacement crews often had mere weeks of training compared to the veteran tankers who'd fought in France, Russia, and North Africa. Still, every engagement where HVAP rounds allowed American Shermans to destroy Panthers without losses was an engagement that preserved American lives and equipment for the final push into Germany's heartland. In the cold mathematics of total war, that preservation mattered enormously. The broader lesson that emerged from the HVAP experience would influence American military procurement and doctrine for decades. The United States had demonstrated an ability to identify a critical capability gap, Sherman vulnerability to Panther armor, and develop a technical solution within the constraints of available resources and industrial capacity. The solution wasn't perfect. It didn't eliminate the gap entirely, and it came with significant resource costs and distribution challenges. But it was sufficient to change tactical outcomes, and it was delivered to combat units quickly enough to matter. That combination of rapid development, realistic assessment of what was achievable, and effective distribution would become a hallmark of American military adaptation in subsequent conflicts. The human cost, ultimately, was where HVAP ammunition justified its existence beyond any technical or doctrinal arguments. Staff Sergeant Henriksen, who would survive the war and return to Ohio to raise a family and rarely speak of his combat experiences, estimated that HVAP rounds had saved his life on at least 4 occasions when his Sherman engaged Panthers frontally and won battles that standard ammunition would have turned into funeral pyres. Multiply Henriksen's experience across hundreds of Sherman crews facing thousands of engagements, and the HVAP program's value becomes clear not in penetration tables or metallurgical analysis, but in young men who came home to their families instead of dying in burning tanks on foreign soil. That, in the end, was the measure that mattered most. April the 26th, 1945 found Oberleutnant Heinrich Müller sitting in a disabled Panther near the Bavarian town of Straubing. His war effectively over, though Germany would not surrender for another 12 days. The Panther's transmission had failed 3 days earlier, a mechanical problem that had plagued the design since its introduction, and no replacement parts existed in the crumbling supply system. Müller's crew had drained the fuel tank to give its precious contents to another Panther that might still fight, and now they waited for American forces to arrive and make their surrender official. In the silence punctuated only by distant artillery, Müller reflected on how thoroughly the war had turned against Germany and how much HVAP ammunition had contributed to that turn. From his perspective as a Panther commander who had fought from the Ardennes to Bavaria, Müller could trace the evolution of American anti-tank capabilities with bitter precision. In December, the black-tipped rounds had been a shocking surprise that negated the Panthers' primary advantage. By January, they were an expected threat that forced constant tactical adaptation. By March, they were simply part of the landscape of defeat, one more advantage that American forces enjoyed alongside their fighter bombers, their artillery, their endless supplies of fuel and ammunition, and their growing confidence that victory was inevitable. The HVAP rounds hadn't defeated Germany alone. Nothing so simple could explain the Reich's collapse. But they had removed one of the few remaining advantages that German armor had possessed. Feldwebel Weber, sitting on the Panther's engine deck smoking a cigarette that Müller pretended not to notice despite regulations, offered his own assessment. "We were always going to lose, Herr Oberleutnant. Too many enemies, too few of us, not enough fuel or ammunition or time. But those American rounds made it faster, made it cost us more." Weber had survived the entire war from Poland in 1939 to this quiet Bavarian afternoon in 1945, and his judgment carried the weight of that improbable survival. When we could rely on our frontal armor, we had a chance in each engagement. When the Americans could hurt us from any angle at any range, it became mathematics, and mathematics was never on our side. The final accounting of HVAP ammunition's impact would occupy military historians for decades after the war's end. American Ordnance Department records indicated total production of approximately 87,000 HVAP rounds for 76mm guns between August 1944 and May 1945. Of those, roughly 43,000 reached combat units in the European theater, with the remainder going to the Pacific theater, training stocks, and retained inventory. German records, fragmentary and incomplete due to the Reich's collapse, suggested that HVAP rounds were responsible for between 450 and 600 Panther tank losses, along with additional Tigers, Panzer IVs, and other armored vehicles. Those numbers represented approximately 15 to 20% of all Panther losses on the Western Front during the HVAP deployment period. Significant, but not overwhelming. The majority of Panther losses still came from other causes: tank destroyer fire, artillery, airstrikes, mechanical breakdown, and abandonment due to fuel shortages. But that 15 to 20% came from a source that previously hadn't been able to inflict such losses. Sherman tanks, once considered vulnerable victims when facing Panthers frontally, had become legitimate threats. The psychological and tactical implications of that transformation exceeded the raw statistical impact. Lieutenant Colonel James Leach, who had commanded armored units from Normandy to Germany and would later teach armor tactics at Fort Knox, wrote in his post-war memoir that HVAP ammunition gave Sherman crews the confidence to engage Panthers on something approaching equal terms. That confidence translated into tactical aggression that, combined with American numerical superiority, proved decisive in hundreds of small engagements that collectively determined the campaign's outcome. Leach's assessment captured a crucial truth. Wars were won not through single decisive weapons, but through the accumulation of small advantages that, combined effectively, proved overwhelming. The German perspective, as recorded in post-war interrogations and memoirs, acknowledged HVAP's impact, while noting that it had arrived at a time when German defeat was already probable for other reasons. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, in post-war testimony, stated that the American HVAP ammunition complicated our tactical situation but did not fundamentally alter the strategic reality. Germany lacked the fuel, the industrial capacity, and the trained replacements to sustain armored operations regardless of American anti-tank capabilities. Manteuffel's assessment was probably correct in the broadest strategic sense, but it underestimated how much tactical complications accumulated into strategic consequences. Major Ernst Bauer, whose intelligence reports on HVAP ammunition had been largely ignored until too late, survived the war and provided detailed testimony to American interrogators about German intelligence failures regarding the ammunition. His account emphasized how institutional dysfunction and resource constraints had prevented effective intelligence analysis even when raw information was available. "We knew the Americans had tungsten shortages," Bauer explained to his interrogators. "We knew they were developing improved anti-tank ammunition. We failed to imagine that they would develop distribution systems allowing effective use of limited production. That failure reflected our own resource constraints. We couldn't imagine doing what they did because we couldn't have done it ourselves." The American crews who had fired those HVAP rounds in combat generally had simpler assessments. Staff Sergeant Henriksen, in a letter home written in May 1945 after Germany's surrender, wrote, "Those black-tipped shells saved a lot of American lives. Before we got them, facing a Panther was about the scariest thing you could do in a Sherman. After we got them, it was still scary, but it was a fair fight. That made all the difference." Corporal Delacroix, Henriksen's gunner, would tell his grandchildren decades later that, "The day we got those special rounds was the day we stopped being victims and became soldiers who could fight back on even terms." The technical legacy of HVAP ammunition extended beyond World War II into the Cold War era and beyond. The principles underlying HVAP design, using lightweight sabots to accelerate dense penetrators to extreme velocities, would evolve into the armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds that became standard anti-tank ammunition in the late 20th century. The tungsten shortage challenges that had limited HVAP production would drive development of depleted uranium penetrators that offered similar performance without the tungsten scarcity issue. The distribution and accounting systems developed to manage scarce HVAP stocks would inform ammunition logistics doctrine for specialized munitions in subsequent conflicts. But in April 1945, as Müller waited for the Americans to arrive and Henriksen prepared for redeployment to the Pacific Theater, the legacy and lessons were far in the future. What mattered in that moment was simpler and more immediate. A weapon system that the Germans had never expected to threaten their Panthers had done exactly that, changing the tactical calculus of armored warfare on the Western Front. The Americans had identified a problem, developed a solution within their resource constraints, and deployed it effectively enough to alter battlefield outcomes. The Germans had failed to anticipate the threat, failed to recognize it when it emerged, and failed to counter it effectively once recognized. In the brutal arithmetic of total war, those failures had accumulated into a cascade of tactical defeats that contributed to strategic collapse. June 8, 1994, brought together an unlikely gathering at the United States Army Armor Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Aging American tank veterans and their former German opponents assembled to commemorate the 50th anniversary of D-Day and discuss their experiences. Among them sat a white-haired Jack Henriksen, 72 years old, but still carrying himself with the compact efficiency of a tank commander, and Heinrich Müller, 76, who had spent 45 years in civilian life as an engineer, but never quite lost the bearing of a Panzer officer. The two men had never met in combat. The Eastern and Western fronts were vast, and the chances of any two individual crews facing each other were infinitesimal, but they shared the bond of men who had fought the same war from opposite sides and survived to seek understanding. The conversation inevitably turned to HVAP ammunition, which the American veterans called the Great Equalizer, while the Germans referred to it more grimly as the round that changed everything. Müller listened to Henriksen's account of that first Panther kill in November 1944, nodding slowly. "We knew something had changed," Müller said through a translator, though his English was quite good. "The reports came in. Panthers penetrated from the front at impossible ranges, but High Command was slow to believe it. By the time we understood what we faced, you Americans had refined your tactics, and our options were limited." There was no bitterness in his voice, only the flat acknowledgement of historical fact. Henriksen pulled from his pocket something he'd carried for 5 decades, a single HVAP round, deactivated and rendered safe, that he'd kept from his final combat loadout in May 1945. The black tip was faded, but still visible. "This round cost $78 in 1944 money," he said, running his thumb over the distinctive marking. "My entire monthly pay was $50, so this single round was worth more than half a month of my life, officially speaking. But I figure each one of these I fired was probably worth about 50 years of my life, because without them I probably don't make it home from the war." He handed the round to Müller, who held it carefully, examining the weight and balance. $78, Müller repeated softly. "We spent years developing the Panther to be invulnerable from the front. Millions of Reichsmarks in design and testing, and you defeated it with better metallurgy and industrial capacity. Not a bigger gun, not heavier tanks, just a better bullet and enough industrial strength to produce it in meaningful quantities despite resource constraints." He returned the round to Henriksen with a slight nod. "That was the difference between our nations in microcosm, I think. We built quality we couldn't sustain. You built sufficiency you could produce in quantity." The museum's curator had arranged a display featuring a cutaway HVAP round next to a cutaway standard M62 armor-piercing round, with metallurgical analysis and penetration data. The younger veterans, men who had served in Desert Storm and knew modern armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds, studied the HVAP design with interest. The principles were clearly ancestral to modern ammunition, though the implementation had evolved dramatically. A tank captain who had commanded an M1 Abrams in Kuwait noted the similarity. Same concept, really. Light, fast projectile with a dense penetrator, just refined over 50 years of development. Dr. Stephen Zaloga, the military historian who had organized the symposium, moderated a discussion on HVAP ammunition's broader historical significance. His assessment, informed by decades of research and access to American, German, and Soviet archives, was that HVAP represented a crucial case study in military adaptation and innovation under constraint. The United States faced a significant capability gap, Zaloga explained to the assembled veterans and historians. German heavy armor was superior to American tanks in direct comparison. The U.S. couldn't redesign and field new tanks quickly enough to close that gap before the war's critical phase. So American engineers developed ammunition that partially closed the gap instead, and American logisticians created distribution systems that made limited production strategically significant. The German veterans generally agreed with that assessment, though some noted additional factors. Former Hauptmann Werner Schmidt, who had served under Müller, observed that German tactical doctrine had become rigid, assuming Panther frontal immunity. When that assumption failed, we adapted slowly. American forces adapted faster, developing new tactics to exploit their new ammunition, while we were still debating whether the threat was real. The acknowledgement of American tactical flexibility, coming from former German officers who had spent the war fighting American forces, carried particular weight. The conversation shifted to the human element. The men who had loaded, aimed, and fired those HVAP rounds under fire, and the men who had died when those rounds found their targets. Henriksen spoke quietly about the moral complexity of killing. Every Panther we destroyed probably killed the crew inside. 4 or 5 men, most of them about my age, who probably didn't want to be in that tank any more than I wanted to be in mine. The HVAP rounds gave us the ability to kill them from the front instead of having to flank them or call in artillery. I'm grateful for that ability because it kept me alive, but I've never forgotten that each round I fired successfully was 4 or 5 families getting terrible news. Müller responded with equal gravity. We made the same calculations from the other side. Each Sherman my crew destroyed was 5 American boys who wouldn't go home. I try not to think about it too much, but after 50 years the nightmares don't really stop. The HVAP rounds changed the tactical situation, but they didn't change that fundamental truth. We were all young men trying to kill each other because old men had decided we should. The room fell quiet for a moment, the weight of that shared memory hanging over veterans from both sides. The symposium concluded with a technical presentation on the evolution of anti-tank ammunition from World War II through the modern era. The HVAP round that Henriksen carried occupied a crucial position in that lineage. The first successful American implementation of hypervelocity penetrator design, the proving ground for concepts that would evolve into modern kinetic energy ammunition. The engineering principles validated in those 87,000 HVAP rounds, manufactured between 1944 and 1945, had influenced ammunition design for every American tank developed subsequently. In that sense, the black-tipped rounds that had surprised German Panther crews in the forests of Belgium had never really left service. They had simply evolved. As the veterans departed Fort Knox, Henriksen and Müller walked together toward the parking area. 2 old men who had once tried to kill people like each other and had somehow survived to become friends. Do you think it mattered? Henriksen asked. The HVAP rounds, I mean. Would Germany have lost anyway? Müller considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Germany would have lost, yes. Too many enemies, too few resources, too many strategic mistakes. But the HVAP rounds helped determine how quickly we lost and how many American boys went home. From where I stand 50 years later, I think that mattered very much. You went home to your family. So did I, eventually. Many didn't. If those special rounds tilted the odds even slightly in favor of more people surviving, then yes, they mattered. The final accounting of Germans never expected, HVAP rounds to make 76mm Shermans Panther killers, extends beyond statistics of penetration and destruction into the realm of human consequences and historical contingency. The ammunition didn't win the war. No single weapon system ever does in conflicts as vast as World War II. But it changed tactical calculations, preserved American lives, accelerated German defeat, and validated engineering and industrial approaches that would influence military development for decades. The Germans truly hadn't expected a modified 76mm gun to threaten Panther frontal armor, and that failure of expectation, combined with American success in developing and deploying a solution to the Shermans' inadequacy against heavy German armor, represents a case study in how wars are won, not through individual technological superiority, but through the accumulation of sufficient advantages deployed effectively enough to matter when and where it counts. Henriksen kept that deactivated HVAP round until his death in 2008, when it passed to his grandson, along with his other war memorabilia. The grandson, a Marine veteran of Iraq, recognized in that black-tipped shell the same principle that had kept him alive in Fallujah: the importance of technological edge, however slight, when lives hung in the balance. The specific technologies evolved, from HVAP to APFSDS to whatever would come next, but the underlying truth remained constant. In combat, the difference between sufficiency and inadequacy, between survivable and fatal, between victory and defeat, often came down to details as small as a tungsten core wrapped in aluminum, traveling at 3,400 feet per second toward a target whose crew never expected it to arrive.